Hold on to your hats and bear with me here. This is not going to be my normal opening. There was recently a very closely watched election in Hungary where Peter Magyar defeated Viktor Orban. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Magyar didn't campaign on Orban's 16 years of undermining democracy or his slow stripping away of the rights of the LGBTQ community or anything like that. Instead, Magyar campaigned on Orban's corruption. And that corruption was easy to see, for example, with this road that leads nowhere. See, this road was half built with EU money, and then the other half of the money was pocketed. It just vanished. And it's a point that's very easy to make to the electorate. That guy is corrupt, and he's stealing from you. And indeed, Magyar won in a landslide. But why does an election of a country with 10 million people matter to a fantasy world builder? Well, one of you asked me to talk about corruption and how to use it to build a fantasy world or include it in a fantasy world. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What corruption is, what it isn't, and how you can use it to make your world and your plots richer. Welcome to another episode of Just In Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Before we start, let me just make one thing abundantly clear. I find corruption in the real world to be repugnant and immoral. The theft of money earmarked for the good of society harms us all. Bribery used to get around the law creates an unstable environment where only the wealthy thrive, and that is not a society I want. This discussion today is about corruption in a fantasy context, and despite my glee at discussing these plot lines, it should not be confused with approval for corruption as a real thing. Second thing, the algorithm is going to hate this video. Please do me a solid and share it far and wide. Third thing, I'm going to be discussing recent events. I fact-checked this to the best of my ability, but I'm more discussing the narrative of these events that can be told as a story rather than doing a completely factual political analysis of the events in question. So don't take it to heart too much. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get going. It is helpful to look at corruption through two lenses: the universal institutional standard and the culturally situated social reality. First, let's talk universal definition. Most international bodies, such as Transparency International, define corruption simply as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. That is one hecking broad definition, and it's meant to be objective and value neutral. It doesn't matter if you are in Helsinki or Havana. If a public official takes money to bypass a regulation, that is corruption because it breaks the contract between the state and the citizen, whatever that contract is. The state official has been entrusted with power and has used that power to make his own wallet fatter. Okay, but that's such a broad definition, it's almost useless without cultural understanding of how an official is entrusted with power. And that's an important point. Abuse of power is seen in different ways by different cultures, especially in three main areas. First, nepotism versus loyalty. In many societies, there is a strong cultural imperative to support one's family or community, especially in collectivist cultures. If an official secures a job for their cousin, an observer from an individualist culture sees corruption, nepotism. However, in the official's culture, they might be seen as failing their moral duty to their kin if they didn't help get the cousin the job. Or if your whole culture is built on inheritance of power through family lines, nepotism would not even enter the equation as a form of corruption. The second fine line to consider is gift-giving versus bribery. In many cultures, gift-giving is a fundamental social lubricant, a way to build trust or show respect. The line between polite, culturally expected appreciation gift and a bribe meant to secure a quid pro quo is often incredibly thin and context dependent. And finally, and this is a very interesting area that we'll spend a chunk of time in during the last part of this video, the patron-client network. In some developing economies or historical political systems, corruption is actually the primary way resources are distributed. An influential leader provides services or jobs to a network of supporters in exchange for their loyalty. And while this looks like corruption to an outsider, to the participants, it is simply the only functional way to navigate a system where formal institutions are weak or non-existent. This also goes back to feudalism, as land was distributed in exactly this way to warriors who then supported their liege. As I said, this is a great system for drama, and there will be more on this topic in this video at the end. Now, to get back to corruption, even in cultures where you have a patron-client relationship, or nepotism as a good thing, or gift-giving, there is a line. It might just be hard to define that line. The consensus among sociologists is that the line is crossed when the action undermines the public good. Even if a society has a norm of helping one's family, if that practice prevents the most qualified person from doing a critical job, the cultural practice creates societal harm. So if the king puts his idiot child in charge of the army, even the most ardently noble supporters will be protesting. Now, before we go into how magic can play into corruption, it's clear from everything we've talked about so far that understanding your culture is a critical part of building corruption into that culture. And if you need help building out your culture, may I recommend Worldbuilding Blueprints, Volume 1. This is the book I wrote on world building, which you can buy on my website. Cultural world building occupies a huge part of this book, and it includes a model to give you a way to not only understand your culture as it is now, but also to create the history and mythos of your culture. And this book isn't just theory. There are exercises and worksheets and some truly gorgeous art, even in the black and white edition of the book, which you can get on my website. And I'll give you a discount. If you use the code CORRUPT, all in caps, the first 100 people will get 30% discount on any of the digital editions on the links on my website down below. So, pick up the book if you want to support the channel, and let's get back to corruption. In a fantasy world, corruption creates some fascinating additional elements. First, there is of course the additional items of value that can be exchanged. In our world, bribery is around items of wealth or items that can be exchanged for wealth like money. In a fantasy world, that wealth can be represented with very different elements than in our world. You could have corrupt mind readers who steal secrets in a way that is against the norms of their culture. Think about Bester from Babylon 5, which is a show you should watch if you haven't already. Everyone had to be super careful around Bester because despite the laws against invading people's privacy as a psi user, as a magic, as a mind reader, he was known to just lift a few ideas here and there. A very corrupt and very dangerous man. Or you could go darker and use lifespans as currency. Maybe the ruling class lives forever by leeching time from the lower classes. If you want your kid to get into a good university, just pay over a few years of your life and they're in. There was a very bad movie called In Time from 2011 that played around with this concept, and it could have been so great, but it was so badly executed. Sorry if you liked the movie. I really wanted to. It had such great world building, that concept, but the execution was okay. Anyway. Another way you could have fantasy and corruption intersect is through the currency of influence, especially divine influence. Corrupt priests are nothing new, the good Lord knows. Corrupt priests spawned the whole Protestant movement, starting with good old Martin Luther and his 95 articles, which he did not nail to a church door, but that's a story for another day. But what if your divine corruption came from magical power? What if your priests peddled the divine influence of their god or the source of spiritual power in return for wealth? I touched on this a little in my episode about sacred groves, which you can check out in the information card, but this could make for great drama. If this corruption also caused that spiritual power to change or to become sick or maybe even to start dying. There are some very interesting metaphors you can play with in terms of corruption and its effects in a fantasy world. Maybe certain plants stop growing or some blessings stop working. Mercedes Lackey played around with this in her Kingdom of Cars, as we found out in the Mage Storm trilogy. There, false priests took over the theocracy, and though the god's blessing faded, the priests used magic to fake miracles and called up demons, claiming that the god had blessed this practice. And this corruption was allowed to go on for years, until the birth of a hero who finally spoke out against the practice and resulted in the god's statue coming alive and crowning said hero as son of the sun or the leader of the theocracy. And that brings me to the third item that I wanted to talk about under the topic of corruption: potential storylines. Let's circle back to that Hungarian election. The thing about Orban is that he had almost total control of the media. It wasn't state-controlled, no, it was way more subtle than that. Orban had fined media organizations and sued them and variously driven them into distress. And then his cronies bought those organizations. So Peter Magyar could get no time at all on the official Hungarian media channels. Now, of course, there is social media, but the problem with social media is that it will only get you the cities. And Orban had changed Hungary's election so that one vote in the countryside was worth roughly 3 in the city, with kind of how they were divided. So to win, Magyar had to win the countryside, and they were not so much on social media out in the sticks. What Magyar did will, I hope, be the source of a movie someday. First, he did get elected as a member of the European Parliament. He never went to Brussels to take up his seat, but he got elected, and that's important because an MEP enjoys double immunity. They cannot be detained, held for questioning, or prosecuted for opinions expressed or votes cast in performance of their duties. And during parliamentary sessions, MEPs are shielded from detention and legal proceedings, both in their home countries and in another member state. So, even though Orban controlled the police, he couldn't arrest Magyar without breaking EU law, and he wasn't ready to risk doing that. So Magyar was safe to travel Hungary, and travel he did. In a beat-up car with barely any money, he crisscrossed the Hungarian countryside, stopping in every village, hamlet, and town along the way. He listened to people, he told them Orban was stealing from them, he proposed his own solutions. And he won by an overwhelming majority. Also, shout out to the left-leaning parties of Hungary who didn't run any candidates and instead threw their weight behind Magyar. They don't agree with him politically, but they judged democracy more important than policy, and so they delivered the city vote to him. Anyway, the point is, Magyar's story is hella clever and brave, and it involves a lot of work. And it illustrates some of the core storyline points of a hero resisting corruption. The first is the origin story. Magyar was part of Orban's party for a long time, and I'm certain he said to himself, this is just the way Hungary is. You gotta join the party to get ahead. I just live here, it's not up to me to change the world. That creates great conflict in a character, having to be part of a corrupt system and having to then resist it. And it also gives that character insider knowledge for when they do stand against the system. The second thing you need is an inciting incident. In February 2024, it was revealed that President Catalan Novak had granted clemency to a man who helped cover up a pedophilia case in a state-run children's home. There's some twists and turns, but this was Magyar's breaking point and where he split away from Orban, spending the next 2 years building that movement. And finally, there's all the clever strategies and hard work the hero needs. Finding a way to protect yourself from the corrupt organization. Magyar did this by getting onto the EU Parliament. In your world, that might involve magical protection or a powerful but distant patron who could be called in, though it would cost both parties everything if that happened. Like, say, a dragon who would annex the kingdom. No one wants that, but if the hero is pushed far enough, he will press that button, and that could create a situation where the villain has to leave the hero alone. Magyar crisscrossed the countryside to convince people to vote for him. In your world, it might not be a democracy. Patronage networks might be the way your culture works, so your hero might need to convince people to abandon the corrupt leaders' networks and join his. Or he might need to convince the common people to abandon the corrupt leaders completely and withhold their labor. Or he might even reach for a mystical sword and grab it from a lake.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
Or think of Martin Luther, who we mentioned earlier. Luther's story has a lot in common with Magyar's. He was an insider, an Augustine monk, and a theology professor who knew the system intimately and reached a breaking point. His inciting incident was the sale of indulgences, basically the church selling forgiveness for sins, often to fund the priests' lavish lifestyles. Luther thought this was a profound corruption of Christian teaching, and said so, loudly and in writing. The church was the most powerful institution in Europe, so how do you protect yourself from that? Luther found his equivalent of the EU parliamentary immunity in a powerful but distant patron, Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. Frederick didn't necessarily agree with Luther, but he was politically motivated to protect him from Rome, and crucially, the Pope needed Frederick's political support more than he needed Luther unalived. So Luther had a shield. For spreading the word, Luther got lucky with timing. The printing press was relatively new, and his writings spread across Germany at a speed the church simply had no answer for. By the time Rome decided Luther was a serious threat, ordinary people, peasants, nobles, merchants, had already read his arguments, and many found them convincing. The lesson for your world building is the same as Magyar's. To resist a corrupt, all-powerful institution, you need protection by someone or something that the institution can't easily touch, and you need a way to go over the institution's head and speak directly to ordinary people to convince them of your legitimacy. As for the other side of the coin, how corruption gets started, it's basically a story of half inches. Actually, there's an awesome fable in David Gemmell's John Chanel stories that puts it very clearly. Some roses are growing in a bed, and a weed took root and poked its head out above the soil. As the gardener was coming to pull the weed up, the weed protested to the roses, "Am I not also a flower? Do I not smell sweet? Am I not allowed to enjoy the sun on my petals?" And the roses, being kind, agreed and spoke on behalf of the weed to the gardener. And the gardener let the weed be, and the weed grew mighty, until it threw the whole garden under shade. And the roses said to the weed, "Are we not your kind? Do we not smell sweet? Are we not allowed to enjoy the sun on our petals?" And the weed said, "No." Obviously, like all fables, it's somewhat oversimplified, but it illustrates the growing story of corruption. At first, it's just a little bribe to make the bureaucracy go faster, or buying a single indulgence so you can do the devil's tango with your girl. Then maybe it's a kickback on a government contract. Then it's a judge getting a holiday home and looking the other way while a business harms a community. And suddenly you're asking yourself, how did we get here? But it's all through the story of half inches. Everyone takes a half inch of the money until there's nothing left for the people it's meant to help. And that's the story of corruption from its growth and hopefully its decline. And now, while the awesome members of the channel scroll past, let me tell you about the politics of the client-patron networks and how you can use them in your world building, because they are so underused. And they're honestly so dramatically useful. The first thing to understand is that the patron-client network is not corruption with a fancy name. It is a system of mutual obligation. The Lord gives land, protection, jobs, or favors to his clients. The clients give loyalty, labor, soldiers, and political support back to the Lord. Everyone knows the deal. Everyone benefits. In a world where formal institutions are weak or non-existent, no courts you can trust, no police that aren't owned by someone, no social safety net, this is actually a rational and functional way to organize society. Your Lord is your bank, your lawyer, your job agency, and your insurance policy all rolled into one. The Romans had a beautiful word for this. The patron was the fons honorum, the fountain of grace. All good things flowed from him. Want a promotion in the legion? Your patron speaks to his patron. Want your lawsuit to go away? Your patron knows the magistrate. Want your son to get into a good school? Well, you get the idea. And this is important for your world building because it means political power in such a system is not about territory or armies, but about your reputation as someone worth being loyal to. Which brings us to the single most dangerous thing a patron can do in such a system. Stop being generous. This sounds almost laughably simple, but bear with me. In a patron-client system, generosity is not charity. It is the literal exercise of power. When your Lord hands out lands, offices, and favors, he's not being nice, he's doing his job. The moment he stops, because he's greedy or he's broke or because he's just stopped paying attention, his clients start looking around for another fountain of grace. And ambitious people in a patronage system always have options. They can shift loyalty to a rival lord. They can start building their own networks. They can simply wait, because a patron who cannot distribute favors is a patron who is already dying politically, he just doesn't know it yet. And when he dies, his influence network will be up for grabs. In storytelling terms, a lord who hoards is a lord on a countdown clock. The interesting question is, who pulls the first thread? This setup causes a tension that gives us as world builders great drama to use. And that tension is nepotism versus meritocracy. In a pure patronage system, you promote your most loyal people. But loyalty and competence are not the same thing. And every patron eventually faces the moment where those two values collide. Do you give command of your army to your loyal but mediocre cousin, or to the brilliant general from a rival family whose loyalty you're not sure of? The corrupt choice and the smart choice are not always the same choice. And sometimes the nepotism choice or the corrupt choice is what keeps your network stable, even if it makes the army worse. This is a genuinely hard problem, and it's one that real historical rulers wrestled with constantly. The Ottomans tried to solve it with the Janissaries, who were raised to have no family ties. The Catholic Church used celibacy in kind of the same way, where priests didn't have children with which to build a dynasty. The Chinese emperors liked eunuchs as bureaucrats for the same reason. Less political networks to build a dynasty, more meritocracy. Your fantasy world can use similar solutions, or it can let the tension fester, which is sometimes more interesting. If you want to create a patron-client network system, consider mapping out spheres of influence. Who does Lord X provide for? Who owes him? And where are the gaps? Where are the people who used to be in his network and aren't anymore? Those broken patronage links are almost always where your story starts. a knight whose land grant was promised and never delivered, a merchant family whose tax exemption has been revoked, a general who won a war and got nothing, while the court favorite got all the credit. These people are politically homeless, and politically homeless people in a patronage system are extraordinarily dangerous because they have nothing to lose and they know the system. When you're creating this kind of system, don't worry so much about territory and borders. Think more about who is your fountain of grace and why. Who used to drink from that fountain and doesn't anymore, and who is powerful enough to offer an alternative stream. That's where your civil wars start. It's where your rebellions come from, and it's where the most interesting characters live. Right at the point where the network breaks and someone has to decide what to do about it. If you made it this far, leave me a Hungarian flag in the comments. And if you want to see more from me on the topic of political systems, check out my video on feudalism, and I will see you soon for another episode.